Hello, welcome to the second lesson of 2 that explores representations and a deeper dive into Stuart Hall's constructionist theory of representation. This lesson will focus a little bit more on stereotypes and also take in a theory called hegemony that was conceived by a guy called Antonio Gramsci. So what we're going to do is to understand how representation contributes to this theory of hegemony and also explore alternatives to it and look at a bit of diversity in representation. But first, back to stereotyping. And I'm going to use a quick case study of a stereotype within the media. This is a social group, I suppose you would describe it as, a region of British society, people from Liverpool, also known as Scousers. Not a term I use too often. I know it's a term that is taken with great ownership by some natives to this city, and others are quite repelled by it, if you like. But whatever you're feeling, I'm going to use the word because it's typical of the stereotype, if you like. But before we get into some examples, I'd like you to just give maybe some ideas or have a think. What specific media products can you think of that use a stereotype of people from Liverpool? So be specific as you can, give a couple of examples if you can as well. Now, whatever examples you gave to the answer to that question, it might have been characters from TV, probably comedy, possibly drama, maybe even music video or even advertising perhaps. You might well have seen that those stereotypes used the characteristics that we talked about in the last lesson that reinforce stereotypes, that are picked upon, if you like, to construct a stereotype, namely the idea of appearance, behaviour, suitable for the medium, and a comparison with normal, if you like. I'm going to use for my example a specific medium, all 4 texts, all from the same medium, and that is viral images or online viral images, what we might describe as memes, I suppose, that kind of idea. Basically just single photograph jokes, I guess. So let's start with appearance. So this is where physical appearance, clothing and the sound of the voice can be accentuated or reinforced as part of the stereotype. You've probably guessed the look already. Yes, it's the curly hair wig, the moustache. The football kit is part of the stereotype. The image below may be a little bit more well thought out perhaps, but this is a computer keyboard with all of the letters of the alphabet replaced by the letter A, playing on the kind of accent and the idioms of the local dialect. And instead of your kind of function keys at the side, you've got calm down, calm down, calm down. Okay, so this plays on a couple of stereotypes regarding the appearance of the people of Liverpool. I'm sure you probably would have guessed that anyway. If you're not sure where that came from, it's kind of an interesting one, really, regarding Liverpool being at the height of their footballing powers during the 1970s and 80s, became when the team itself, Liverpool Football Club, became, I guess, a global brand. And many, in fact, if you look back at images of that time, many of the players had this kind of curly permed haircut and moustache, and for no other reason than it was a kind of a popular look of the time. But when you've got people who are very, very famous, then that becomes considered indicative of the place. It would almost have been similar if people had assumed that the Beatle cut was unique to Liverpool as well. So that's appearance, and of course behaviour comes into this as well. It reinforces typical things that people from this group might do. Well, there is a stereotype that the city has a fixation with football, that it is obsessed by football, where of course there is a huge interest in that for good reason, but there are many people who have no interest in football from Liverpool as well. So there you go, appearance and behaviour. any other things you might have guessed might appear regarding to behaviour? Here's two more viral images. So there we go. First one is a picture of an office chair up on bricks instead of its wheels, and as the last one is an aeroplane with its landing gear removed and on stilts instead. Okay, this time, of course, the behaviour being played upon is the idea of theft, petty theft, crime, that kind of idea. Which you might seem a little bit unfair, but we'll come to that in just a second. So this is to do with behaviour. If we look at this third one, the stereotype is constructed in ways that fit the particular medium. In this case, they do. All four images are just single cells. They're easy to understand, very quick to get, and of course that's entirely in keeping with the conventions of a meme or viral image. In terms of the fourth characteristic of constructed stereotypes in the media, always a comparison with something real or imaginary with the normal. So we know what a normal keyboard looks like, which makes that funny. We know what an office chair would look like. We know that a football stadia will have people who obviously look different to each other, not quite so uniform, and we know what an airplane should look like as well. So that is that comparison. In terms of where the stereotypes come from, as I said, with the appearance one, it comes from a sort of contextual history. In terms of the behaviour one and the kind of ideas of the idea of a city like Liverpool being somehow disproportionately affected by crime, I think this is kind of a little bit unfair, but it probably follows around a lot of urban areas where there is a high density of people. We know that crime is likely to happen in more urban areas as well, and I don't suppose Liverpool has really got any higher crime rate than any other city. It's just that it is a big city. But that's not to say it's not in any way damaging. I mean, these images by themselves are probably pretty harmless, even though they do reinforce some negative aspects about a place. Some media products can take negative stereotyping to an extent where, well, arguably it perhaps replaces reality. Here's a rather, maybe, again, just a single-celled cartoon from a newspaper that might seem fairly harmless. It's a little bit insulting, maybe not necessarily even based within a kind of grain of truth. I don't think there's any statistics to bail out the fact that that Liverpool has a history or a problem with underage pregnancies any more than any other place in the UK. So it's kind of, whilst it's making a joke, it could be seen as a little bit spiteful. And of course, that continual knocking or ostracising of a social group can sometimes lead to maybe the replacement of reality. And of course, probably many of you are thinking right now about an incredibly famous front page of Britain's biggest selling tabloid newspaper, The Sun. This is the front page in question from 1989. It's reporting the Hillsborough disaster and sometime after, where it suggested that the facts in bullet points are the truth. And we can analyse how the newspaper try and reinforces this idea of the news it's presenting as being the truth, just as much as we can analyse how there is a stereotype of Scousers being reinforced here. So there you go. There's the two questions for you before we look at why they did this. How have they done it? First one, how have they presented what they've said in this newspaper as factual evidence? And second question, what has been done to reinforce an existing stereotype of people from Liverpool? Well, the first question is really in the format of the newspaper. It's quite interesting how the headline runs with this title, The Truth, obviously the irony being that the front page is full of lies. But by boldly claiming something, acting as an authority figure. Remember, this was an era when newspapers still had quite the sort of credence of being a place where most people would get their information and were trusted. So a headline that had in black and white the words "the truth" would be quite convincing for many. Interestingly, they've run with a picture of an authority figure on the front as well. A police officer, again, a figure of authority and establishment that could be, again, there to reinforce the idea of the truth. And then you've got bullet points. Now, it seems maybe a little bit naive to a modern audience to think that something like bullet points would necessarily be a connotation of facts, but that's the impression they're meant to be giving up there. So you've got a sort of combination of elements here that create this idea that what you're reading is unarguable. And of course, the second question, how does this reinforce certain stereotypes? Well, as we've seen from previous images and some of the media products you talked about yourself, there is a stereotype of Scousers that reinforces the idea that maybe these are they belong to a group of people who are antisocial, maybe non-conformists, maybe criminal, maybe violent, and of course these bullet points reinforce that stereotype over and over again, which is incredibly dangerous because of course it moves beyond just the kind of silly, maybe slightly spiteful jokes about a certain place, and can be seen by the rest of the country perhaps as perhaps being something that's true, particularly if they don't know the city. But our question is not so much about how the media reinforces stereotype or how the Sun reinforced those stereotypes, but why. So I'd like you to just have a think about this and give a few reasons. Now, I'll tell you before we start this, the most common answer to this question is to sell copies of the paper, which is maybe an overly simplistic way of looking at this. Yes, newspapers do like to use sensationalist stories, and yes, newspapers do like to shock with their headlines to grab interest. But remember, we are media students and we need to be looking a little bit more deeply. So think about Richard Dyer's 4 reasons why we use media stereotypes and see if you can give some reasons. Why would the Sun have decided to perpetuate, reinforce and use this negative stereotypes of people from Liverpool? Well, hopefully you all came up with the same answer to that question. The answer being that if we looked at Richard Dyer's 4 uses of stereotypes, we would say that this is actually the Sun creating an expression of their own values and beliefs. Okay, they're not simply using it as a shortcut to meaning or a way of an ordering system to understand the story. They're actually using it ideologically. For this to just kind of understand this a little bit more, read the article about how Liverpool clashed with the establishment during the 1980s and have a look at how that's relevant. But it's essentially a discussion of how Liverpool ran up against its own kind of conflicts with the Thatcher government of the 1980s, which is unsurprising really, as a working class city that has always been outspoken, always had a strong identity. It was always going to run into conflict with a deeply conservative government of the time. And that's really where the heart of this lies. Those conflicts, those outspoken moments, the very meaningful support lent by Liverpool to political movements like the miners' strike, because of course Liverpool was facing its own close of industry with the docks throughout that era, meant that there was a kind of a collision between the then establishment, a conservative government led by Margaret Thatcher, and the city of Liverpool. And of course the Sun, as a newspaper, has championed conservative values and the Conservative Party for many, many years now. Despite the fact that it is targeting a working class audience, it does champion the values and ideologies of that political party and system. So undermining, demonising and ostracising the people of Liverpool in a national newspaper, they knew that that agenda would serve to promote the values and beliefs of the party that they supported. However, it's not just as straightforward as saying that the newspaper wanted to negatively stereotype Liverpool because it knew that that would be a benefit to the party it supported. This is, remember, the constructionist view of representation that we're looking at. And this is a construction of a stereotype because we know it was based within an event that happened, but the encoders are completely fabricating the facts that they printed. But how can we say that this is proof of a constructionist approach to representation? In other words, why is this not actually proof of an intentional version of representation like we saw in the past lesson? I'll give you a hint here. Think about what the response to the headline was. Well, of course, the reason this is proof of that constructionist view of representation is because even though the people themselves have been utterly misrepresented, and even though that the newspaper itself completely constructed this representation of Liverpool, the audience still have a say in the constructionist view of representation. The audience still contribute to that representation. And of course, this was the day that the Sun lost a huge amount of its readers, I guess, because the newspaper actually created for itself a big problem when the people of Liverpool boycotted the newspaper because of this. A boycott which remains in place today, some 30 plus years later. And so the readers decided to take an oppositional reading. Now, not all of them, and it's not just confined to people of Liverpool. Of course, people elsewhere who knew the truth, the real truth, also boycotted the paper. But this is proof that the audience can decide to take an oppositional reading, and that contributes towards the representation. So that's why the Sun's infamous front page of their paper from 1989 may well be proof of a construction of stereotypes, but it's also proof of the constructionist approach to representation as well. Okay, let's move along. Let's have a look at representations of place. We're going to have a look at representations of Britain and how it's been mediated and stereotyped in different ways. And first of all, an image from, well, where does the image come from? Where do you think this particular media product is from? Who is doing this representation of Britain? Well, it's not a trick question, and when you realise it, it's fairly obvious. This is quite clearly from the Tourist Board of Great Britain. This is an advert for our country, presumably to people outside of the nation as well as inside the nation. And this is a very simple single image advertisement in landscape with the copy, 5 words: experience Britain, depth, heart, vitality. So, how is Britain being stereotyped here or represented here? Can we do a quick analysis of how we're supposed to see Britain and how that's being achieved? Well, plenty to talk about, even though it's just a very short and small media product. The image itself, of course, should bring up connotations of peace, tranquility, calmness, beauty. It's picturesque. Words that people often use to describe this image as historic as well, because of course of the castle. We're drawn to the different aspects in this image by the rule of thirds, with the top third being the sky and the intersection drawing our attention to the castle, the middle third almost being dominated by that beautiful bluey clear sea as well. And then of course we're made completely aware that the beach is totally empty, a real feeling of kind of peacefulness and quietness about it. The language being used to describe the Britain as well is really interesting. Depth, suggesting that kind of historic, more than meets the eye idea. Heart, which seems to be the idea that, or promote and has connotations of somewhere that has real feeling, somewhere that is warm, somewhere that it's about its people, and vitality, somewhere that maybe slightly juxtaposes the kind of stillness of the advert, but the vitality suggests that there is kind of life to the country. My favourite word, though, of course, on this advert is experience. The encoders could have chosen a lot of different words here, maybe see Britain, come to Britain, go to Britain, but they've gone for experience, which is a really nice word, which implies participation. It implies an involvement, not just a passive consumption, if you like. The word experience implies a kind of an experience is something that's memorable, something that's tangible. So Britain has been stereotyped in this way to make it appealing, to sell it to another country, to sell it to people from within this country, that they should be proud of their nation. There is an element of patriotism here with the kind of use of the red, white, blue, reminding us of the Union flag. But of course, it's been stereotyped to just give off very positive vibes here. So in many ways, whilst this advert is very simple and might be argued as a shortcut to meaning, it is, again, a way of expressing values and beliefs. It is setting an agenda here. This advert is ideological. It's trying to boost the tourism trade of our nation. Now, of course, who's doing the representation makes a difference here. If you or I took this photograph and put the copy onto this, Experience Britain Depth, Heart, Vitality, we may just be doing it simply as a shortcut to meaning, to show Britain's kind of rural, ancient side. But when we know that this is the tourist board of the UK, then of course that it does set an agenda. What we've done there, of course, is we've gone back to and we've reinforced that idea that media products and representations within media products are basically governed by media language, a system of signs, okay? Totally reinforced by this. The image of the castle, the image of the sea, the composition of the photo, the use of the words, the use of the colour of the words, all of these are codes and signs, and they all contribute to that representation of a place in this instance, albeit for ideological reasons. But Britain can be stereotyped not only by its place, but by its people. I'd like to make a list now of different British stereotypes, okay? Now, consider that list as being based on things like appearance and behaviour and iconography. And if you can, think of some texts that use these stereotypes. Where might you see those stereotypes being used within the media? Be as specific as possible, okay? I've picked a few here. We've got our floppy-haired, romantic, bumbling, posh gentleman in the form of Hugh Grant, the only role he seemed to play in films for many years. In the middle there we've got our chav stereotype, often used in a number of texts for comedic or dramatic purposes. And then we've got our classic English gent with bowler hat, as represented by the character John Steed in the 1960s TV series The Avengers. Nothing to do with the MCU. When you're thinking of the media products that reinforce those stereotypes, decide on whether these stereotypes are used as an ordering process to quickly understand a media product or as a shortcut to meaning. Now, of all the stereotypes that you may have mentioned, one that you might have popped up in many of your ideas, and a common stereotype really, is that the English have bad teeth. It's often used for comedy purposes, as shown there in the American film franchise, the Austin Powers movies, brilliantly played by Mike Myers. And it's often only seen in American texts, American comedy shows and sketch shows and sitcoms and so on. It's not often a stereotype that we associate with ourselves. And that's not to say the British can't laugh at themselves. In fact, I think quite often we do. So if this is only a product of American text, if this is a stereotype which is constructed within American media, why might we see this as an expression of values and beliefs? Why might the stereotype of English having bad teeth might not just be a shortcut to meaning, but actually have an agenda behind it? Well, this, on the surface, seems like one of those questions that sometimes students outside of media studies have a bit of a problem with, the idea of over-analysing, of over-deconstructing things. That, okay, if a British character's got bad teeth, that's just part of the comedy of a media product. Well, in some ways, yeah, but in other ways, it has an undercurrent to it as well. In America, your dental work is all covered by your health insurance, which is something you have to take out because the American medical health system isn't free at point of entry like our National Health Service. And of course, our dentistry work can be carried out via our National Health Service in the UK. And this is a fundamental difference between the United States of America and the United Kingdom. We have had a National Health Service now for since 1958 for it's been a cornerstone of our society. It's been something we're deeply proud of, and of course it's something that election after election people fight to maintain. But of course in America the system is seen as being socialist in its values. It's something that people are very scared of. In many cases it becomes an even bigger political hot potato over in the States. It divides entirely. So in some ways we could argue that perhaps the representation of the Brits having bad teeth is a way of saying that a National Health Service, this socialist system we have in place, doesn't always work and leaves people with less than perfect dental care, contrasted starkly with the Americans, who all seem to have beautiful teeth. So there we go. Maybe that's a reason. Maybe the bad teeth stereotype is actually an expression of values and beliefs. Now, national identity can be used in a number of ways. Okay, 3 iconic images here: the classic British bulldog, the Union flag, and Winston Churchill, leader of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. Put all those together, how can we use that? Well, of course. Oh, yes, we've got the Churchill dog. How do advertisers exploit and contribute to representations of Britain? Constantly. The idea of Britishness and patriotism is used over and over again, not just by advertising, but by other politicians as well. Iconography of Britain can be hijacked, used by others to put themselves in a positive light. The image here of Churchill next to far-right politician Nick Griffin, leader of the former British Nationalist Party. So there are many iconic images of Britain. I'm sure you can think of plenty. We're going to focus on a couple from an era that Churchill was from himself, to look at British ideology. And this is a poster which has a caption, "Spirit of the Blitz," reference, of course, to the Blitz, which during the Second World War was the bombing raids that took place, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, flying over Britain, dropping bombs all over the United Kingdom, mostly in industrial areas and ports, to really damage the supply lines. So and strategic targets where there were kind of huge population densities. So obviously London was hugely damaged and destroyed by the Blitz. Other cities such as Liverpool and Coventry were also hugely affected as well. So what happened at this time was that shelters were built in people's gardens and installed in people's houses, and often communities and families would rush to the shelter whenever they heard the air raid sirens. But this is a media product of itself, a single image with those 4 words, "Spirit of the Blitz." And this does represent a number of British ideologies. Which ideologies does it represent? Well, of course, it represents the ideology of community and family, sticking together, seeing things out together. It also represents that ever so British ideology of the stiff upper lip, or encapsulated by another wartime poster so perfectly: "Keep calm and carry on. No matter what happens in the face of adversity, you can keep smiling and stay together." Interestingly, the old wireless radio there in the background has the ideology of a nation that communicates, that's always ready for action as well. Of course, what's interesting as a little side ideology here, we have a very strong female representation. Of course, at this time, many of the men would be conscripted to take part in the war effort, either in the UK or overseas. But there's a reliance on the women back home taking charge, taking care of the family and everything that we held dear to us. And whilst these are all things that are ideologies that were definitely clear and were definitely true at the time of the war, Roland Barthes might describe these as part of his mythologies. So Barthes would often interrogate pieces of cultural material, media products, for example, but other things as well, brands, consumer goods. And he would say that these pieces of cultural material actually expose how bourgeois society, the ruling classes, are using them to assert their values upon others. So he says that the media is a great way of reinforcing middle, upper class values onto a kind of working class society. So his example: portrayal of wine in French society is seen as something that is robust, it's healthy, it's something that just everybody should partake in. Now, of course, that's a bourgeois ideal. That's something that keeps afloat the kind of wine industry in France, and it's contradicted by the reality of wine, that wine can actually be very unhealthy if consumed in large doses. It can be inebriating and cause headaches and sickness. But of course, the way that wine is represented in French society is that it's healthy, robust, traditional, even patriotic in many ways. So, of course, he found that, as you'd expect, that semiology, the study of signs, is useful in interrogating media and cultural artifacts to understand the truth, to understand if something is a mythology. So let's look at this media product again with a different set of eyes. Yes, it tells us all of these ideologies about patriotism, togetherness, readiness. But what doesn't it tell us? What does this leave out about the Second World War? Well, of course, what this poster doesn't show us or doesn't reinforce is the idea that the Second World War was a time of great fear. Whilst it might celebrate stiff upper lip, it also neglects to tell us that many people were absolutely terrified for their lives. They felt, in real anguish about these things. It might celebrate togetherness, but it also doesn't reinforce or doesn't mention the fact that the war was a great time of separation, whether it is the fact that the families were literally torn apart from each other because of conscription or evacuation, but many people lost their lives, changing families completely. This may reinforce the idea of sheltering from the effects of war, but of course it doesn't show us the devastation and destruction. So we can see this as a mythology. It doesn't negate the ideologies we saw before, but at the same time it doesn't tell us the entire truth. What other mythologies of Britain are created by the ruling classes? In other words, this poster may have been used for morale purposes, and that's fine, but what other mythologies, what other things about Britain are we told by the ruling classes that are just taken for granted? And this idea of ideologies being taken for granted leads us on to our key theory, hegemony. Now, I'm just going to interject and interrupt myself here by saying that some people pronounce this word as hegemony, but I don't. You may study this subject in other A-level topics as well. It comes up in sociology and probably in politics and history as well. So let's get a bit of a definition for this. The hegemonic model says that the ruling classes maintain their power through control of ideas and culture rather than force. It's a key idea that. So rather than ruling through the violence or the threat of violence, hegemony is the idea of ruling through control of ideas, ruling through ideology. But before I suppose we can understand this in more detail, we need to understand who the ruling and dominant classes in society are. Make a profile. Who do you believe to be the kind of standard or the template of the most dominant and powerful people in society? Well, your profile probably looked something like a person who is middle-aged, probably male, probably white, probably with a family, probably working in business, possibly in finance, possibly in politics, in a position of responsibility and authority, probably part of the middle upper classes with a big disposable income, and then probably based in the southeast of England. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people who are women or non-white or from a different age category that aren't part of our kind of ruling classes in society. However, what we're looking for is the kind of dominant makeup of that society. And that's been the case for many years. In fact, I guess that middle upper classes block has knocked the upper classes out of being the kind of rulers in society, in our British society, somewhat. Whereas maybe a few hundred years ago, the kings, queens and lords, barons and so on would be the lawmakers and decision makers. Now it's much more people who are the CEOs of companies and corporations, maybe the people who have kind of positions of authority and have made their money through business rather than inherited money. So that's our kind of ruling classes. And so the hegemonic model says that these people will maintain their power in society through the control of ideas. And of course, many of those ideas could come from the media. Let's have a look at a couple of front pages from Britain's biggest selling national daily newspaper, The Sun. As much as we may dislike it, there's no getting around the fact that The Sun sells more daily newspapers than any other. And so what The Sun says politically can often be seen as potentially a way of swaying ideas and taking control of people who are maybe reading these newspapers, who are part of those kind of proletariat, if you like, the everyday working class in society. The top one here is a newspaper front page from the 1990s. In a general election, Neil Kinnock was the leader of the Labour Party, and the headline reads, "If Kinnock wins today, will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights?" Implying that Britain will not be a place that you would want to live if the Labour Party were to win, implying that it would be a place to bail on. Sure enough, the Conservative Party won by a landslide in 1992, and the Sun ran with the front page, "It's the Sun what won it." So can we take that as true? Is it, is the influence of this newspaper so much so that it has the power to kind of win and turn an election? If we think about this profile of the dominant classes in society, how closely is it to the people who run the media? Well, the answer is it's very close. The newspaper proprietors and owners are often and almost exclusively upper class or middle upper class, middle-aged white men, people with big disposable incomes, huge amounts of money actually, whose ideologies can be seen right there on the front pages of these newspapers, whether that's Rupert Murdoch or Lord Rothermere or the Berkeley brothers. Okay, and if we think about the alternative, the people that these newspapers usually stereotype in a negative way, could they be more different? Think about how asylums and seekers and refugees are negatively represented by these tabloids and other newspapers, how women in positions of power, how teenagers are represented. It's stark contrast, and that would reinforce the idea of hegemony, that these days people in power, unlike centuries ago where if you were a king and people disagreed with you, chop off their head or throw them in prison or threaten violence, these days if you're in a position of power, you can maintain that power by controlling people's ideas, maintaining that status quo in society. This is called hegemony. A more sophisticated approach to hegemony argues that actually the mass media, their role in this is to actually adopt a consensus of what is normal, a common sense, which is actually an ideology. The very nature of common sense means that the audience doesn't question it. Common sense, if you like, you might think of as a kind of set of civil religion, values that majority of people subscribe to without ever really thinking about it. Here's my top tip of the day. If you're ever in an argument with someone, just to end the argument, just say that your point of view is common sense. It's almost impossible to argue against it. But that's what the media does. It legitimizes things and makes them seem as if they cannot be questioned and argued. Okay, we're going to use the Sun again here. This front page was from 2003. The time in which was that Britain was joining in with the United States of America in a war in Iraq. Now, this war was very controversial. It came in the wake of 9/11 and the terrorist atrocities in New York, as well as other places in the world. But there were many people opposed to this war. 2 million people marched in London opposing it. Many felt that either that the money could be spent better in the UK, or that the war was illegitimate and was merely a sort of a grab for oil. So this was not something that was wholly agreed upon by a nation of people. And yet, what's interesting is that this newspaper makes supporting a controversial war seem like it's just common sense. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to analyse this front page of The Sun and say, how does this make the idea of supporting the war seem as if it couldn't be questioned? So there are a number of devices going on here. Okay, the obvious one is the patriotism used in the Union flag. If somehow you didn't support this war, then you would be unpatriotic, which of course is a nonsense. You could be both love your country but also not support the war it would be involved in. The second one is that imperative. Put this flag in your window, almost telling you what to do, almost giving you an instruction, a command, no suggestions, no alternatives. Third thing, of course, is the image of the soldier, which is anchored by that single line of copy: support our boys and put this flag in your window. Now, it's quite clever, this, even if it is simple. The idea of supporting our boys, the idea being that supporting the war and supporting the soldiers are identical things, exactly the same, and that if you didn't support the war, then perhaps you wouldn't be supporting the soldiers, which people would maybe see as being a bad thing. But of course, those two things aren't inexorably linked. You could still support troops without supporting a war. The other clever thing, of course, is putting a human face to it. Make it, rather than dehumanizing this, they're humanizing it. You're looking at a specific person. And of course, there we get onto the most manipulative part of this: support our boys. 2 words there. One, the pronoun of our, making it feel like it's a collective responsibility. Second of all, the word boys. These aren't men. These are people who are potentially vulnerable and in need of our protection. And all of these things are done to just make this seem like a legitimate idea, a common sense hegemony in action. Have a think about this. What other ways can news media make ideological points seem like they're just common sense and things that you can't argue with? You might have had a number of ideas there. Use of statistics and facts, manipulation of those ideas, use of celebrity endorsement or appealing to authorities, repetition of ideas. There are a whole number of ways in which the media can actually hammer us so much with an ideology that it does end up feeling as though it can't be questioned. However, hegemony has a little bit more depth to it. This is the man himself, Antonio Gramsci, who came up with the idea. He was an Italian Marxist. And he added to his thoughts and said that hegemony is potentially always threatened. This common sense, this consensus that the ruling classes hold, can only be maintained so long as the subordinate classes agree to it. The people at the bottom strata of society have to give their consent to these ideologies. The subordinate classes can actually pose a challenge to that hegemony, and the consensus can be broken. So therefore you see society as more of a constant struggle between different ideologies that are competing for that hegemony. So let's have a think about how this has changed over time and where some of those ideologies may have won over. What dominant ideologies have there been in Britain's past that we now see as being outdated or perhaps even old-fashioned? Well, of course, there are a number of these. 150 years ago, many of you in education now would probably be out working or in the home in a domestic role. The idea of sending kids out to work, doing dangerous labour tasks wasn't really, too much of an eyelid wasn't batted in sort of a Victorian or Dickensian era. Also, while we're down there, the right for women to vote. Okay, the idea that women should be seen and treated as equal citizens of society, not second-class citizens, is something that's evolved over time as well. But there are other sort of more subtle ideologies. Perhaps we live in an era which is incredibly child-focused and child-centred, and that hasn't always been the way. The idea of more and more people accessing higher education, again, is a relatively new ideology in our society. Looking the other way, if we go back in time, we could look at the idea of democracy, which I alluded to before. It's a system that's maybe been around for less than 1,000 years amongst a people that have been on this island for thousands and thousands of years. So ideologies shift, they move, they're potentially always in struggle. More recently, I guess, we've seen the hegemonic ideal of being part of the European Union slowly shift towards from seeing it as a wholly good idea to being challenged as an idea. Even if that referendum was very, very close, there seems to have been a shift that the dominant ideology is that we're better off leaving the EU than being a part of it. So ideologies evolve and they shift over time, and this is part of hegemony. So some of you may have already gone back to this and thought, well, we can relate this idea of hegemony to the representation of Liverpool in the Sun. That was hegemony in action. That negative stereotyping of the people of Liverpool. The story, the truth, the ironic story, if you like, of the lies, is proof that the ruling classes will try and use the media as a means of maintaining their control, of undermining those people who would perhaps be opposing their ideological system. And of course, it's also proof that hegemony is always potentially threatened, that there's always a struggle. The fact that the newspaper was boycotted by the people of Liverpool, the fact that the Hope Not Hate campaign exists today as a reaction to it, is proof that hegemony is a struggle. And we have seen, the Sun perhaps suffer a few blows over the years, and that maybe it's a newspaper that will struggle to find more and more support the more it lies about people and more it victimises and negatively stereotypes people. So my next question before we move on to a different idea is, what other representations can you think of that might be considered as hegemonic? In other words, what other stereotypes or representations are presented to us in the media that are common sense or are portrayed as common sense, but might actually just be reinforcing the dominant ideologies in society? Well, hopefully you came up with a few for that, or even just one or two would be great. I'm going to directly link this to the final point that Stuart Hall makes in our specification, that stereotyping tends to occur when there are inequalities of power. Subordinate or excluded groups are constructed as different or other. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. The fact that some groups in society will be negatively stereotyped by the media because they are in conflict with the dominant ideology of the society. They are in conflict with the ruling classes' version of society. The most obvious one for this, for me, is the idea of immigration and migration, and also refugees and asylum seekers to a lesser extent. But the tabloid press, owned, controlled by the ruling classes, constantly negatively stereotypes people from overseas, those from other countries who the ruling classes see as a threat to the values of the UK. Just a collection of newspapers there, and I'm sure many of you said this in your answer. But of course, even if you've seen these newspapers, you'll possibly be aware that there is also a kind of backlash against this idea, a backlash against the kind of racism and xenophobia of attacking people from other nations. And so maybe people power has more to it than we first expected. Maybe there is an alternative to hegemony. This alternative is called pluralism. Okay, back to the Sun, I'm afraid. But let's have a look at this front page. The Sun backs Blair. Give change a chance. Now, the Sun is currently a Conservative supporting newspaper. It backed Boris Johnson in the most recent election, and it backed the Tory MPs that were in favour of Brexit as well. But for a short period of its life, it actually backed Labour's Tony Blair in the late 90s in the general election in 1997. Now, by 1997, the Conservative Party had been in power for 18 years. They had been mired in a number of scandals in the mid-90s, revolving around some sex scandals when they were promoting a kind of back-to-basics family values ideology that many felt was hypocritical. Some MPs were caught being paid to ask questions in the House of Commons, and the first expenses scandal came about. There were council elections in 1995, which basically showed that the Labour Party were going to win by a huge majority. And sure enough, they did. So, was the Sun basically just jumping ship, making sure that it was on the right side of history, watching where the votes were going, making sure that it wasn't going to be just representing a very small number of readers left who were Conservative voters? Interesting, and this would back up the idea of what we call pluralism. Pluralism is, in its general sense, the acknowledgement of diversity. The pluralistic model says that the media is diverse and it has a wide range of available choices for consumers. So rather than the media influencing the consensus, our consensus values influence media representations, and that's where the Sun changing allegiances would come in. Spying the fact that the ideology or the dominant ideology in society was behind the Labour Party at the time, the Sun decides that it will back Blair. After all, the main function of the mass media is to entertain, to please their audience, to provide representations that meet the audience's expectations. And this is where stereotypes come in. They pander to the views of the audience. They represent, in many ways, the dominant ideologies of society. The more media institutions pander to their audiences, the more products they're going to sell, the more units they'll shift, the more papers will be bought. So this idea of pluralism is really interesting. I guess it puts more onus on the audience for their part in reinforcing stereotypes, whether positive or negative. But it also suggests that the media is just there to please us rather than to control our ideas. So how powerful is the audience? How much choice do we have in society when it comes to our ideologies? Will the media do whatever it can to try and alter our ideologies, or can we manipulate and alter it? That's pluralism. First question on this is, how does social media give weight to this argument of pluralism? How is maybe social media proof that the audience has power more or greater than the media itself? Well, there's a lot of answers, different answers to that question. I'm sure you'll have your own perspectives and point of views. What I do want to do is give you an example of what I would describe as pluralism in action. And I'm going to go back to 2005 in a pre-social media era. In fact, a pre-internet memes era even, okay. And what this is a website that was emerged, just sort of appeared, if you like, a few days after the attacks on London, known as the 7/7 bombings in 2005, where a number of public transport buses and tube stations were bombed, resulting in the loss of about 54 lives in London. And this website cropped up called We Are Not Afraid, and on it were a number of viral images that people emailed and were hosted on the website. Some of these were images that people had manipulated themselves. Some of these were more maybe conventional memes. The Yoda one on the right-hand side there, "Not Afraid I Am." Some of them were just photographs taken, like the one of the Union flag with "We Are Not Afraid" written on it. Some were using other media products, such as the use of the intertextual references to the Shaun of the Dead poster, "We're Not Afraid," or the iconic London Tube sign. Some of them even went as far as including other historical figures like Julius Caesar and Hitler, and saying that they're not afraid. And this kind of sprung up overnight. This was, in fact, the website became so overloaded that they had to close it and reopen it. And these days we wouldn't think of this at all. This would be like a hashtag. On social media, Instagram, Twitter, we would see this kind of devotion to something all the time. But this seemed like a bit of a one-off. This seemed like the first time something like this had happened. And my argument would be that this is an example of pluralism. This is an example of the audience enforcing the agenda, the ideology. Maybe we've seen this during the pandemic as well, in certain ways, in certain Facebook and social media groups and so on. But rather than dig out different examples of pluralism in action, I just want to close with a very simple question, but one that's very difficult to answer. Which argument do you find most convincing? Hegemony or pluralism? Do you believe that the media is under the control of the ruling classes, those who have the most to lose, and therefore it will embed ideology after ideology that maintains their power, and they do it in a way that makes it seem like those ideologies are just common sense and that can't be questioned and shouldn't be challenged? Or do you agree with pluralism, that actually if we see stereotypes, they are because they're a reflection of how society stereotypes people? If we see the media representing ideologies, they are our dominant ideologies in society, and that ultimately we as a group control the media rather than the media controlling us. Hegemony or pluralism? It's a really tough one. No sitting on the fence. Have a go. Put forward your argument. Which one do you find most convincing? Hegemony or pluralism? Thanks very much, folks. All of this will feed into many, many more of the analyses we do of representations in the future. It is the backbone of so much of the stuff we look at with representations. So I hope you've got your head around this. But if not, never hesitate to ask questions and keep looking at media products from different ways. Thanks again. Cheerio.